Hi, I'm Margarita R. Sonko, formerly Deputy Director General of the National Economic and Development Authority. Today we're going to discuss Session 2 of Module 1, and this is on the Post-Disaster Rehabilitation and Recovery Program Framework. What are the learning objectives for this session? First, we would like you to understand the different elements of the Disaster Rehabilitation and Recovery Framework, and second, to apply the post-disaster rehabilitation and recovery framework to different types and scales of disasters in your particular localities. We are going to discuss the post-disaster rehabilitation and recovery framework. There are different types of disasters. I'm sure you know all about this, but let me refresh your minds. You have the natural disasters. Examples of these are the geophysical, earthquakes, landslides, tsunamis, and volcanic activities, hydrological, avalanches and floods, climatological, extreme temperatures, drought and wildfires, meteorological, cyclones and storm surges, biological, what we're experiencing right now. You have the pandemic, COVID-19. And then you have the man-made disasters. What are these? Maybe it's easier for me to give you some examples. These involve environmental degradation, pollution, and accidents. Examples of these are the gas leak, oil spills, and coal ash spills, which happened in other countries. I guess in the case of oil spills, we have some of these to a little extent here in the Philippines. Scale of disasters also vary. Some are nationwide, as what we have right now, the COVID-19. It covers not only the Philippines, but the whole wide world. Some cover a limited area, as a Taal or Mayon volcano eruption. Some are on a wider scale, as Typhoon Yolanda, what happened several years ago. But what is important to remember, they affect specific communities, like your own communities. Conditions or situations in communities differ in pre-disaster periods as well. You have different physical factors, economic factors, social factors, and environmental factors. The above differences point to the need for different frameworks. Frameworks should be tailor-fit to the areas, sectors affected, as well as the disaster context. So, why do we need a framework? Meeting recovery needs must go beyond simply conducting post-disaster assessments. I'm sure you're familiar with the post-disaster needs assessment. We should build on this post-disaster needs assessment. These are not enough. We just don't want to have a framework to add to the sufferings of the different communities who are already in a disadvantageous position. After each disaster, reports show the number of individuals or households affected, the cost of damages to industry, agriculture, forestry. This is not enough for resilient recovery. A recovery framework builds on disaster tool assessments, as I mentioned earlier, the PD&A. Recovery measures should be aligned with ongoing development. You will see later in the framework that the sectoral or thematic outcomes have to be aligned to the medium-term outcome for disaster risk reduction and the country's long-term goal. A framework would also guide governments and other implementing stakeholders in the medium and longer-term recovery efforts. More importantly, a framework will help in articulating a vision for recovery, defining a strategy, prioritizing actions, fine-tuning planning, and providing guidance on financing, implementing, and monitoring for recovery. Take note particularly on the monitoring of the implementation of the different programs, projects, and activities. Through the framework, the government will be better positioned to drive a process that unites all development partners' efforts. With this framework, development partners' initiatives will be consistent with governments and the community's efforts. If you will recall, after disaster, there's so many governments who would like to provide assistance to the affected communities. But we want to make sure that their assistance is where these are needed by communities and not just kanya-kanya, no? Like kuminsan, some communities have been receiving so much assistance while the others are not receiving any. So with the framework, you can tell them, we need more assistance here, what type of assistance? And the framework will help you guide along this line. By developing a framework to manage recovery, a government may be better able to address long-term disaster vulnerabilities through coherent program. Take note, coherent. Hindi yung kalat-kalat, pero parang nagkakaisa ka. It's coherent, it's one whole, integrated approach to the recovery process. It should bridge the gap between recovery and development. Hindi pwede yung recovery hiwalay doon sa development efforts na ginagawa ng community even before the disaster. Such programs could address disaster-resilient housing, building code enforcement, safety nets, green growth, and climate change resilience. If you will note, ayaw natin na mangyari na if there's another disaster, anong nangyari before, mangyayari na naman. So we need to come up with higher standards for buildings, like you revise the building codes. Will they be able to withstand a 300 kilometer per hour strong wind, like what happened, I think, during the time of Yolanda? Another reason why we need a framework is to be able to prioritize disaster risk reduction and resilience measures in the short and longer term development goals. And lastly, and I'd like to emphasize on this, a framework provides an integrated program-level action plan to facilitate multi-sector recovery planning, prioritization, and activity sequencing. So what are the different components of the post-disaster rehabilitation and recovery framework? There are 5 components, and I will be discussing this individually. You have the long-term goal. The long-term goal for disaster rehabilitation and recovery is to have safer, adaptive, disaster-resilient Filipino communities who are protected from risks and can cope with and recover quickly from disaster events. This is consistent with the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Framework. More importantly, this goal incorporates the principle of build back better. So what do we mean by building back better? This means that post-disaster reconstruction shall not only be a restoration to its pre-disaster condition, but also incorporating a higher level of resiliency standards, as well as climate change and mitigation measures in all the different post-disaster rehabilitation and recovery interventions. The next component of the framework is the overall outcome, or the medium term, which states that economic and social conditions in disaster-affected areas are restored with a higher level of resiliency and poverty reduced. Just to refresh your memory, what does an outcome mean as compared to an output? Outcomes are the desired results from the implementation of a recovery and rehabilitation program. This must be guided by the policies and strategies embodied in the medium-term Philippine Development Plan. This involve changes in behavior, knowledge, skills, and our behavior as a result of the project. The likely or achieved short-term or medium-term effects of an intervention are what we call the outcomes. When you talk of output, these are just the tangible deliverables from a project. So, if you will also take note, we mentioned also poverty reduced in the overall outcome in the medium term. It is generally the poor who tend to suffer more from disasters. Poverty is both a driver and a consequence of disaster risk. Economic pressures force people to live in unsafe locations, which is related to exposure, and conditions. Susceptibility to the impacts of hazards is often, but not always, associated with certain groups, including women, the elderly, disabled, migrants, and displaced populations. Let's move on to the different sectoral outcomes. You have, for example, it depends on the framework that you're coming up with. These are just examples of sectoral outcomes. One, you have livelihood and business development. What do you want to achieve or see at the end of implementing interventions? You want to see sustainable income sources for households created, stability of businesses restored. Ang gusto nating makita, matatag ang mga negosyo ng mga tao, and then ang mga mapagkukunan nila ng kita, tuloy-tuloy yan, hindi lang, one-shot deals. In the case of agriculture and fisheries, one of the outcomes that is expected is restoration or increase in agricultural production. Support services for farmers, fisher folks, farm laborers are made accessible. Anong ibig sabihin nito? Makakamit ito ng mga mangingisda or yung mga farmers, nakakarating sa kanila. Hindi, kasi kung minsan sinasabi ng gobyerno, may assistance kami binibigay, financial assistance or technical assistance. Hindi naman umaabot yan sa mga fisher folks or the farmers. So gusto nating makita na they are benefiting from all these different government support services. Another sector is housing and settlement. Families should have access to affordable, disaster-resilient housing that are located in safe zones and in areas where social services and public facilities are available, or financial assistance is also made available. Kung maalala ninyo, during the time of Yolanda, which happened in the coastal areas, there were a number of people that had to be resettled. But what happened? Bumalik sila kung saan sila nanggaling kahit dangerous ang mga areas na yon. Bakit? Kasi kung saan sila dinala, wala yung hanap buhay nila. Tapos, walang source of tubig, walang ilaw. Siyempre, anong gagawin ng mga tao? Gusto nila makita na may hanap buhay din sila. At saka, may supply naman ng electricity at saka tubig. Another area, social services. Ibig sabihin nito, education, health, and social protection services are made accessible or upgraded. Anong examples na masasabi natin dun sa social protection services? Palagay ko mas familiar kayo dito kasi you deal more with your respective communities. You have what you call the 4Ps or the Pantawig Pamilyang Pilipino Program. And more recently, because of the pandemic of COVID-19, di ba, nagkakagulo doon sa social amelioration program na binigay ng gobyerno. Ang sinasabi, may nakatanggap nito, yung iba hindi nakatanggap kasi mali yung mga listahan. And then, yung iba, bakit mataas ang binigay na amount, yung iba naman mas mababa. So, ito yung mga binibigay sa mga persons with disabilities, senior citizens, or those working under no work or no pay situations. Next, anong isang component pa ng framework? Moving on, you have what we call the general strategies. These are those which involve general approaches on how the expected outcomes shall be achieved. From the general strategies, specific strategies shall be crafted for the areas and sectors that have also been affected by the disaster. Another component are the cross-cutting issues and concerns. Bakit kailangan address ang mga cross-cutting issues and concerns? These have to be considered to ensure inclusive, take note of inclusive, kasama lahat, and coherent strategies that address specific sectoral concerns. Hindi pwedeng kanya-kanyang i-address ang mga issues na to kasi they are all related. They cut across. They affect all aspects of a program, and therefore they need special attention. They should be integrated in all stages of the program, projects, from planning, take note, from planning sa umpisa pa lang, until impact assessment. So what are these cross-cutting issues and concerns? You have the vulnerable groups. Sigurado, alam na ninyo kung sino itong mga vulnerable groups, no? These are the men, women, the youth, children, elderly, migrants, and PWDs. So their needs have to be addressed also. Then you have culture sensitivity. community values, beliefs, and traditions have to be respected and protected and valued during the rehabilitation and recovery activities. If you will note, may mga IPs kuminsan natatamaan din sila o naapektuhan din ng mga disasters. So, kailangan din i-preserve or take into consideration their respective beliefs and traditions. Gender and social inclusivity. Men and women differ in the way that they are affected, they respond to, and recover from disasters. So you need to recognize the different needs, vulnerabilities, capacities, yung mga kakayahan ng mga tao, mga roles, mga tungkulin nila, and responsibilities of men and women during disasters. So, environmental protection and sustainability, this also cuts across the different interventions in the recovery program. The impacts of the different measures on the environment should be assessed. Mapapahamak ba yung natural environment because of some of the measures that we are going to implement? So, isa yan dapat nasa pag-isip natin para maintindihan kung tama yung mga measures that we want to implement. Another cross-cutting concern is disaster risk reduction. Reducing future disaster risks in disaster-affected areas can be achieved through the implementation of an integrated approach to disaster risk reduction and climate change. For example, you need improved spatial or spatial planning, no matter how you pronounce it. Sanay kayo dun sa mga land use zoning, di ba? In the regions or in the cities, municipalities, you have your land use framework plans. So you have to consider also the impact of these different measures. And then, local governance. This one is also very important. Institutions, policies, and mechanisms should be put in place to ensure sustainability of interventions along with strengthening the DRRM capacities of LGUs and communities. What is important when we talk of local governance is that community members and other stakeholders should have inclusive and meaningful participation in planning, monitoring, and implementing activities. So, kailangan dyan na nandyan ang participation ng mga tao na naapektuhan ng disasters. Hindi lang na this is forced upon them just to accept, but they should have a say in how some of these different interventions are to be implemented or planned. Okay, so next I'm going to show you a diagram of the general framework for post-disaster rehabilitation and recovery. As I mentioned earlier, there are linkages among these different components. You have the long-term goal, as we mentioned earlier, safer, adaptive, and disaster-resilient Filipino communities that are protected from risks and can cope with and recover quickly from unfortunate events. Then you have the outcome, overall outcome in the medium term, followed by the sectoral outcomes. Note that the sector outcomes are aligned with the overall medium-term outcome and the country's long-term goal. So there's a relationship among these different components. And then moving on, I will show you also the sectoral outcomes. As we mentioned earlier, these are livelihood and business development, agriculture and fisheries, housing and settlement, and so forth. These are followed by the general strategies. And then you have the cross-cutting issues or concerns. So the first frame and this frame or slides, magkasama yan, kaya lang because they cannot all be contained in just one slide, so we had to break it up. But there's a relationship among the different components of the diagram. So while the general framework, what we discuss is a general framework for post-disaster rehabilitation is prescribed. The actual framework for rehabilitation and recovery planning for each disaster shall be tailored fit to the areas and sectors affected and the disaster context. I hope that was made clear, no? This is prescribed, pero this has to be changed, revised, depending on the current situations. To give you an example, the following slides will show you when I said magkakaiba yan depending on the disaster, sectors affected, or these situations pre-disaster. You will see on your screen the post-conflict rehabilitation and recovery framework on the Marawi siege in 2017. This disaster is due to armed conflict. In addition to the basic sectors of housing, livelihood, infrastructure, and social services, achievement of sustained peace is a core sector outcome. Makikita ninyo dun sa first box, it says local governance and peace building. That reflects the situation obtaining in Marawi at that time. That is why they consider this as very important. So what is the medium-term outcome for Marawi? Marawi City and its surrounding communities coexist in peace and are vibrant, productive, and resilient to risks of conflict and other disasters with culture. Take note, culture, we mentioned about a cross-cutting concern on culture, integrated into the socio-economic development. So you also have the sector outcomes for the Marawi seeds. Now, moving on, the next slide will show you the post-disaster rehabilitation and recovery framework on the Boracay rehabilitation. The framework may not necessarily be sectoral, but thematic or issue-based as appropriate to this situation. The Boracay Action Plan is thematic rather than sectoral in approach. The themes focus on addressing key issues and concerns that cut across sectors. The issues pertain to environmental degradation, pollution, and congestion in the island that led to its closure in April 2018. So iba yung concerns nila sa Boracay, di ba? Pollution, madumi na, so hindi sinusunod yung mga batas. So these are the importance that the communities felt at that time. So ito yung na-reflect doon sa recovery program nila. So I hope you learned something from this brief session, but just to recapitulate, the post-disaster rehabilitation and recovery general framework should, 1, seek to align sectoral or thematic outcomes with the medium-term outcome for disaster risk reduction and the country's long-term goal. Second, it provides for a basis for designing a monitoring framework where possible. And lastly, is tailored fit to the areas, sectors affected and the disaster context. So I hope you have learned something and you will be able to come up with your or craft your respective post-disaster rehabilitation and recovery framework. And I'm sure you're in a position to do that, and I'm very confident that after this exercise, you'll be able to do it. So thank you.